Hi and welcome to .NET Aspire Developers Day. This is .NET Aspire and SQL Server. My name is Jerry Nixon. I'm a product manager on the SQL team, and in this session we'll talk about integrating SQL Server with your .NET Aspire solution. Specifically, what we'll talk about is the database project. That's the SQL database project, sometimes called the SQL Server database tools inside Visual Studio, that allows you to interact with and maintain a SQL Server schema just like it was source code. We'll see more about that in just a second. We'll also talk about the SQL container, that's SQL Server running on Linux, inside a container either on your developer box or perhaps in Kubernetes or inside your CI/CD pipeline somewhere. We'll talk about strategies of seeding your data so that your database has data during development. Also, we'll talk about data persistence across debug sessions, and we'll introduce the Data API Builder. That will give us a data API, both REST and GraphQL endpoints over our SQL Server. Finally, we'll introduce a simple client just to wire it all together so that you can see how everything works. Now, you know about SQL Server, but let me take a second just to talk to you about Azure SQL Database. That's SQL Server in the cloud. With over 250,000 active customers, that gives us more than 10 million active databases. Just imagine managing 1 million databases. We manage 10 million databases. That's over 70 trillion queries in a month. 61 plus petabytes of stored data. In fact, our largest single database is 100 terabytes, which means Azure SQL Database can scale all the way down to the smallest, most modest mobile application, all the way up to the craziest thing you can imagine. It's incredible. But we're going to be talking about SQL Server, and we're going to be talking about Aspire, and the best place for us to start is Visual Studio. I have Visual Studio 2022 here, and it's completely empty. So let me go ahead and create a brand new project. I'm going to go ahead and search for Aspire and just create the empty Aspire project. Let's call it Aspire Day. Beautiful. I'll take all the defaults and let it go from there. I've only got two projects, the host and the service defaults. Now, before I do anything, I want to pretend like we've already got a SQL Server that we're interacting with. So I'll go to SQL Server Object Explorer. Now that's built into Visual Studio. You already have it, and if it's not already there, you can go to View SQL Server Object Explorer. Now, I'm already connected to my local DB, and you will be too. That's because local DB installs automatically with Visual Studio. It's a file-based version of SQL Server just for development purposes. That's extremely fast and easy to use. Doesn't have all of SQL's features, but from a programmatic point of view, it does. So I'll open it up and you can see that it has the same sort of layout and feel. I'll look at the databases and it's empty. This is probably how it looks to you as well. I'll right click here and I'll say, let's create a brand new database and let's call it database because that's really exciting. And so once we have a database, I can go to the tables and see there are no tables either. So let's create a brand new table. In this table, it's going to be called down here, I'll say users. I could use the UI above if I'm not comfortable with T-SQL, but I am. And so let's go ahead and create here. Perfect name. It looks like Copilot knows what I'm trying to do here. So let me go ahead and click the update here, and it gives me the option to generate a script. No, I just want to update the database. And when I do, I can go back and see the table is there. I can expand that and see that in the columns, there's ID and there's name. That's pretty beautiful, right? So I can go here and I can say, actually, I meant full name. Let's go ahead and update the database again. When I say update, I go over here and refresh and I can see its full name. So that's an easy way to interact with an existing SQL database somewhere. But that's not the only thing I want to do. I want to right click my solution. I want to copy the full path because I'm about to create a project, a database project inside the solution. I want to make sure it's in the right folder. So I see that I have my database here. I'm going to right click on it and say create new project. When I do, this pops up and says, what do you want to call it? Well, I want to call it database, not database one. Feels a little bit like class one, you know, when you create a library. And so I'll say not the solution file, but the folder. I want everything to be there. All other defaults, no other change, and I'll click start. Once it's done, I'll go ahead and click finish and then go back over to my Solution Explorer and see, lo and behold, there's a third project. This is the database project. And you can see I have a folder here for DBO that represents the default schema, and in it I have a tables folder, and here is a SQL file, just a text file really, that looks exactly, or almost exactly, I will say functionally exactly, like the file that I used when I created my database table users. But let's say I want to make a change here. I want to change this to see, not full name, but first name, and let's do last name. That's a much better structure for me. So now I can right click on my database and I can say publish, and this is the way I can push back to my database. Inside this dialog, I can go over and browse to my local, and I can drop down my database choice to database. That's the only one that I created there, and click OK. Before I click publish though, I'm going to go over here and create a profile so I don't have to do this again later. So let me go ahead and click publish now that I've done that. And when I do, I can see inside my Data Tools Operations pane, it published successfully. Now I can go into my database and I can refresh my table. And when I go to the columns, I can see its first name and last name. So this is the give and take, the way I can take from an existing database, put it into a project, and then manage it with files. Another file I can create, by the way, is to right click and I can say add a script. We have pre-deployment scripts and post-deployment scripts. I want if not exists, and then here I can say select top one from users, right? Then I can say insert into users. I'll say, oh yeah, that's fine. Now I've got sample data that goes into my database if that table happens to be empty, right? So you can use your own logic if you want to. So I'll right click on my publish file and I'll say publish. When I do, it pulls up the settings from before. I'll go ahead and just push publish, and when I do, it's practically instantaneous. Now I can go over to the users and I can say, all right, let's go ahead and view data. And when I do, there's Jane and John Doe over here in my local DB, which is acting as if I have an existing database somewhere. That's really great. Now that I have this seeded data, the one thing I want to do is make it so that I have all my creates into a specific location so I can reuse those files. So let's just start by creating a folder called SQL. And here I can dump the creation file. So I'll do that by going to the properties and saying I want to create a SQL script. One of two steps that I need to do. The next one here is under build. I want to say the deployment needs to go to SQL. Beautiful. Now I can close this, and I know that if I rebuild this, it's going to fill it all into the SQL folder. I can't see it because I'm not looking at hidden files yet, but if I select it, I can see there's my create file, and I can right click and include that in my project. And when I do, I can go to the properties of it and say, this is not a regular file, just treat it as nothing and do not have a build action. Let me just go in and show you what that looks like. So database create is right here. And it goes, and I'll click this button right here at the top because this is a SQL CMD file. It's specially formatted so it can have scripts inside it. And you can see right here on line 43, if the database is not null. So that means if it already exists, in this case, it is going to alter it and then drop it. I don't want it to do that. In fact, what I want it to do is return so that it doesn't. Great. Let me do one quick thing. I'll right click the database and I'll say, let's open in terminal. Now inside my terminal, one of the things I want to do really quickly, this is a simple command, is echo /SQL into a .get ignore. The reason I do that is I want everything inside the SQL folder not to be included in my repository, right? That's very important. And so let me just do a quick little type of my get ignore, and you can see it's empty except for one line. That's all you really need to make it work. This isn't required. This is just a best practice that you can follow to make sure you don't have a lot of nonsense showing up inside your repository, right? That's nice. Okay, finally, we can get around to Aspire. Now that I have the project ready to go, I can go to App Host, and I can right-click on my App Host here, and I can say Add .NET Aspire Package. This pre-filters NuGet to all of the Aspire packages, and I can additionally filter it to only SQL Server. So here's Aspire hosting SQL Server. I'll go ahead and I will install it. Now that it's ready to go, I can open up program CS, and I can start building out my app host. In order to use SQL Server, I can say add SQL Server, give it a name, and the truth of the matter is that's all I need. That will create the container running SQL Server for me. Now, there's a lot more I need to do to make it useful, but let me just pull up the dashboard here and show you it's completely running, and if I mouse over, I can see it's running version 2022, the latest tag. All right, that's pretty great. Now, you can also see its port number, and it's kind of a problem. So let me go ahead and show you a couple of small tricks. The first one is I want to set a known password. I'll do that by saying builder.parameter, and I'll say it's going to be called SQL-password. No problem. Now that will fetch then the SQL password I want to use for my SQL Server. Now in order to use it, I have to pass it into this method. And then one last thing, I need to set a port so that it's reliable and I know where it is. Now, where does it read SQL-passport? I'm going to right click and go to Manage User Secrets in my app host, and you can see that it's empty. And I'll say, let's start with parameters, SQL-password. Now I'll say colon, and here I'll say password is going to be the SA password for my database. Now, is this a powerful password? No. Is it acceptable for my local development environment while I'm trying to build it out? Of course it is, right? That's the whole point. Once it's published, because it's a parameter, it will, if you're even going to use SQL authentication, it'll prompt you for what the password is. So that's beautiful. All right, so that's all set. Let me run it again and just show you what I mean. It will be here on port 1234, and if I go into the details, I can go down and I can say, what is the password for SA here? And I can say to view it, and it's password. Is that true? Well, if it is, it'll be awful handy if we could just add it to our Object Explorer. So let's right click, go to Add Server, and here, what am I going to add? Well, let's go back and see that it has an IP address of 127.0.0.1. Don't use localhost. 127.0.0.1, comma 1234. The comma indicates that the port is next. So that's the server. I'm going to change it to be server authentication with SA. Put in my password. Make sure I remember it. And most importantly, trust the certificate. This is a developer container with a developer certificate. You need to trust it and say go. Now you can see it's in my list here. I go in and say, what databases are there? None. Wait a minute. Is that right? Yes, it is. Let me show you one other thing I could do. So I'll close this. I'll say var SQL Server. Okay, so now I've put it into a variable. Var SQL database equals SQL Server dot add database, and I'll call it database because that's nice and consistent. If I were to run this again, and I'm going to right now, so that you can see what's inside the SQL Server, everything is running, everything is nice. I go back to the Object Explorer, right click on databases and say refresh, and I still don't see my database. That's because this method doesn't create a database. All it does is ensures the correct initial catalog, that is database, is added to my connection string. So it's really building the connection string, not interacting with SQL Server. If I want to interact with SQL Server, I have to mount some files and do it inside the container. To start with, I'm going to right click on my app host and just create a folder. We'll call it SQL-Server, and this is where, man, haven't we all made that mistake? Let me stop the debugging, then I can rename it. SQL-Server. All right, so inside this, I'm going to place all of the shell files necessary to execute inside my Linux container. And I just did. Behind the scenes here, I added 2 files that are bash shell scripts that you'll be able to execute inside your container. I'll make them available at the end of this session, no problem. But let me show you what they are. The first is a new entry point, and that new entry point runs basically this script and then ensures that SQL Server is running. That's nice. All right, so let me go ahead and show you the script itself. You know that this is going to run inside Linux because it is CRLF. No, it is line feed only. You got to make sure both files are line feed only, otherwise they will not work properly. Okay, so now that these files exist, let me show you how to use them. So first things first, we're going to make a change to the SQL Server. We're going to make two things. So first, I just need a reference. So I just need the path that goes to that SQL Server folder. So remember, a single dot means the current directory. We're inside app host. So this is the current directory / SQL-server. So that's what we've got right here. However, if I'm looking for where the script is, so do you remember it's down in database inside the SQL folder here that we created? All I need is the folder. So dot goes back behind to where the solution folder is, inside the database project, inside the subfolder called SQL. And then I mount those two folders and then change the entry point so that it includes entry point.sh, which is what's going to run my script, which is what's going to ensure SQL Server and what's going to loop through all of the files inside my SQL folder. Doing this will create the initial database for us. In fact, there's no way to believe it except for to see it. And so let's pull up the dashboard and see everything executing, and then go back into our Object Explorer, right click and refresh our database list and see, there we go, and see that the database is there. And when we expand it out to see the tables are there too. And if I were to right click and say view the data, now I'm pulling in John Doe and Jane Doe from the container, right? That's beautiful. The next thing I want to do is think about how can I make it so that my data is persisted across debug sessions. Right now, the database is created every single time. We need to add a volume. Now we're adding it to the server, not the database. So I'll go right here, do a little formatting so it's easy to read, and say add with data volume. And what's it going to be called? It'll be called my data volume, I'll say for now. And when we run this, let me pull up Docker and show you that when we run this, there are no volumes here. Volumes are managed by Docker Desktop. But once we run this, it will create one automatically. Let me go ahead and just execute this so you can see what I mean. It'll go ahead and create the container behind the scenes. It will create the volume. And so here's the volume, my data volume. So you can see it's in the volumes tab here. I have my container here and it's using it. That's really nice. So what that means is if I go back into my SQL Server here and I go to view data, I can make a change. And here I could say Jerry. So it is now changed inside the data, written to my volume, so that now when I stop this, if I open up my desktop again, you'll see that the container itself is closing down. It will disappear, but when I go into the volumes tab, my volume remains. So now when I run this again, it will mount that volume so the data is the same. So I go back over here and I right click and I say let's view the data, and instead of John and Jane, it's Jerry and Jane because it shows the change from last time. The next thing is to add the Data API Builder container. So let me stop this and go back to my program file and add in a brand new container of Data API Builder. So in this case, you can see that I have located my Data API Builder config file, and I've said first, build this container calling it Data API, use the MCR image name here so it's publicly downloadable and it'll cache it for me as well. And then I want to mount this config file up here to this internal location. And then finally, I want to add an HTTP endpoint that I'll be able to use later. Let's go over to my app host and create a folder. And in this case, we're going to create a folder called Data-API. To create this, I want to use the CLI that's built in. I've already installed .NET tool install Microsoft.data-API-builder/G. So this installs the CLI for Data API Builder, which I've already done. Okay. Now I can run the command line dab init, which will create my configuration file for me, specifically for Microsoft SQL, and using a connection string in an environment variable called myConnectionString. I'll also indicate that this is the development mode so that I get extra features. After I run it, I can go up and I can see inside Data API, my dab-config file is there. But there's one more thing I need to add to it, and that's reference to that table that I created called users. In order to do that, I'll use dab space add, so that adds an individual table. This is a funny paint problem that says user, called users. That's my own personal moniker. It's like an alias for the table. And the source is dbo.users. It's really funny. And then -- permissions saying that anonymous star. Basically, there are no real permissions because this is just a demo. So it updates the JSON file. I don't need the command line anymore. And I can open up this file and just show you that indeed, here's the connection string, just like we said. And if I go down into the entities section, I can see here's my user pointing to my users table. Nice, and it's enabled for REST, which is what I'm about to test. So all of that seems right, except for one thing. I don't have the connection string to my database. So how am I going to get the connection string to my database? Well, I say dot with reference SQL database. Now remember, SQL database is the corrected connection string that includes the base connection string plus the database name in its initial catalog field. That's really nice. But there's a problem. If I run this right now, Data API Builder loads faster than SQL Server does. I need to make it so that DAB waits on it. And the way I'm going to do that is by adding wait for. Let me do that in 2 steps, and both of these are going to be through a NuGet package. I'm going to start by introducing health checks for SQL Server. This allows me to interrogate my SQL Server container and know when it's finished building. I'm also going to include a new package called cherry.waitForDependencies. And the reason I'm using this is because it was already built by David Fowler. It's sitting in one of his repositories as a sample, and I added it to NuGet so that we could use it right here. Now these are like other features that are on the way in Aspire, and right now I just need it for this demo. Soon you'll see waitForDependencies showing up in the official channels. Once I've installed it, go back to program and do 2 things. To my server, I can say, let's add health check. All right, so now my server has health check, and I can go down to my DAB container and say dot wait for, and what am I waiting for? I'm waiting for my SQL Server to be ready. All right, so that's great. So now when I hit F5, I know for one that I'll be waiting for that SQL Server to be ready, and then it'll be all set up. Now, one thing we haven't done is correct the connection string. If I go into my data API and I go into the details, I can go down and say, what is that connection string name? Connection strings _ database. No problem. I'll copy the name of it, and I can see what's the value. Perfect. It's the entire connection string into my SQL Server. Now that I have the connection string, I can go into the configuration file, and I can say this is the environment variable you're going to be looking for. I don't need to make any other changes. Everything else is ready to go. I'll debug it again just to see whether or not it works. Once ready, I can go in and I can click the API. I can see the DAB is healthy and ready to go. I can do /swagger, and I can go and interrogate the one and only REST endpoint we have so far. I can say get all the users here, try it out, go down and say execute. And when I do, there's Jerry Doe and there's Jane Doe. Perfect. Now we know Data API Builder works. The next thing we need to do is consume it. The easiest way to consume it is inside a simple project. So let's right click and I'll say add new project. And what's easier than a console application? We'll call it client. I'll say go and go. Now, once I've created this, I can add it to my orchestration. I can right click my project and say add .NET Aspire orchestration support. And when I do, it says it's just going to append it to the one that already exists. That's what I wanted it to do anyway. Terrific. Now I can go back to my app host. And so you can see it right here, already added for me. The missing piece is to say with environment, and I'm going to call it the DAB URL in this case. And I'm going to say DAB server dot endpoints, get endpoints, and I'm looking for HTTP. Once I've done that, I know that DAB URL is going to be set correctly. That is to say, If the endpoint needs to be dynamically created in any way, orchestration will go ahead and do that inside Aspire and then set it for me. That's the reason I don't read it now and then write it. How do I access it once I'm inside the client? The easiest way is to read the environment variable. Now, because this is cross-platform, we're going to follow the rules of Linux, and that means that it's going to be in the process scope. So let me fold up the usings, which won't matter really right here. I can get the base URL then from an environment variable called dab URL. If we go back to our program from our host, we can see that we are adding an environment variable inside our client called dab URL, and it's going to be whatever the HTTP endpoint is. Beautiful. All right, so then I can build out a more complete URI. So in this case, I can say, take that base URL and add /API so I can get to the REST endpoints. Go to users, that's right, and then get the ID of 1 and select only the first name. All right, that's fine. That's all pretty easy. Then I can say, let's use an HTTP client and let's get from JSON specifically. I can put that into a typed class here. I'm getting user, and so as long as it serializes correctly, no big deal. And then I can say, whatever the record is the first one. So single just makes sure only one is returned. And I know that's going to be true because only one is going to match the ID value of 1. The last thing I'll do is to make sure that the client waits for the dab server to be available. So I'll say .wait for, and I'll say dab server. All of the orchestration will be automatically handled by Aspire. So when I go ahead and hit F5 here, we'll watch the orchestration run. Then I could. All right, we've hit the breakpoint that we expected here. And when I go into the record, I can expand it to see the first name is indeed Jerry. ID is 0, that's the default last name, which I can see is capital A. That's hilarious. It was null. That's because I didn't ask for it up here in the URL. I only selected first name. So that's great. I was able to project what I wanted. I was able to interact with my data API. My data API was able to talk to my SQL Server, and my SQL Server was able to create my database, seed it, and maintain that state across debug sessions. There's only one more thing. If I were back at my database and I'm not going to be deploying it through Aspire, I might just want to say .publish as connection string. That means when I use the publishing feature of Aspire, it will actually prompt me for a parameter instead of deploying SQL Server. I can also deploy it as an Azure SQL database. The deployment story around Aspire is really rich. All right, we're done, and I want to just leave you with some resources that you can go to get started with this project, with the SQL container, with SQL Server data tools for Visual Studio, and with Data API Builder. Thanks again for giving me an opportunity to show you how to integrate SQL Server into your Aspire application. My name is Jerry Nixon, and best of luck.